normally at home as you perhaps once used to, and actually someone to help talk you through that.
In a royal household where everything is timed, polished, and performed, no one expected raised voices, especially not behind palace doors. But when Queen Camilla was overheard sharply scolding Princess Charlotte during a closed-door gathering at Sandringham, the tension shattered the usual royal quiet. What followed wasn't an outburst or a press leak. It was Catherine, calm, graceful but resolute, stepping forward in defense of her daughter in a way that left every witness stunned. Her response didn't just shift the energy in the room, it changed how the family viewed authority, motherhood, and legacy. Here's the moment that turned whispers into history. The day that was supposed to be simple. It began as one of those quiet royal afternoons, the kind designed to remind the public that even monarchs have family days. Sandringham had welcomed a small gathering of senior royals and children for a private lunch and indoor garden viewing. There were no photographers, no red carpets, and no cameras. Just long tables with polished cutlery, neatly folded linen, and the scent of roses drifting through the air. It was a setting where tradition and familiarity intertwined, the kind of setting where everyone knows their place and how to behave. But beneath the calm was something more fragile. Catherine had arrived earlier with Charlotte and Louis, while William joined later after a morning engagement. The children had been looking forward to the visit. Sandringham was a place filled with warm memories, a place where Diana had once walked them as toddlers, a place that still felt safe. Charlotte especially enjoyed these visits, often walking the hallways with curious eyes and asking the kind of questions only a child could ask. She was at that age where innocence meets observation, old enough to see what others miss, but young enough to speak without fear. The gathering was meant to be informal, a private lunch among royals followed by an indoor walk through the Winter Gallery. Camilla had taken an interest in arranging the post-lunch gathering, overseeing the room setup, the schedule, and even the seating plan. She wanted it to flow perfectly, to feel seamless and appropriate. But behind the scenes, those closest to her knew she was increasingly tense. Reports had begun to circulate about her growing frustration with the younger generation's independence. There were murmurs of moments where she had felt dismissed, outpaced, or quietly pushed aside. That afternoon, it wasn't clear what triggered the tension, but something shifted when Charlotte entered the room. Observers said the temperature changed. The child was dressed neatly in a forest green dress, her hair pinned back with a simple barrette. She smiled politely, curtsied where expected, and walked in with her usual self-possession. Camilla had just entered from the opposite side, greeting another guest, when she noticed Charlotte standing near a portrait of Queen Elizabeth. It was a moment like any other, until Charlotte pointed to the frame and asked a question, one that would send Camilla spiraling and turn a peaceful afternoon into a scene the royal family would never forget. The day had been meant for calm, but royal life, no matter how rehearsed, is always one breath away from eruption. And for Catherine, who had just stepped away to take a call in the adjacent corridor, it would soon become clear that something had broken, and that she would have to be the one to restore it, not with noise, but with truth, and that truth would change everything. Charlotte's innocent question. The Winter Gallery was filled with history, paintings of monarchs long gone, glass cabinets housing forgotten medals, embroidered chairs that hadn't been sat in for years. To most adults, it was a room of reverence and stiffness, but to a child like Charlotte, it was alive with questions. Her fingers hovered politely near the frame of a portrait that hung at eye level. It was one of Queen Elizabeth II, young and radiant, in a royal blue sash and crown. Charlotte tilted her head and turned to face the woman nearest to her, Queen Camilla. "Did Granny ever sit on that chair?" she asked. Her voice wasn't loud, just curious. Camilla turned, caught off guard by the question. "Which chair?" she asked, her tone polite but clipped. Charlotte pointed toward one of the antique thrones beneath the portrait. "That one. Did Granny Elizabeth ever sit in it, or is it just for looking?" For most, the question would have been sweet, innocent, the kind of thing a child says when trying to connect the dots between the past and the present. But something in Camilla's expression shifted. The room was still, a few staff standing nearby, but none close enough to intervene. For reasons still unclear to some witnesses, Camilla took the question personally. Her face tightened, her shoulders rose slightly, and her voice lowered, but not gently. "Those chairs are not for playing, Charlotte," she snapped. "They are part of royal history and not yours to fuss over." Charlotte blinked. It wasn't the words that stunned her, it was the tone. something sharp and unfamiliar, a coldness that didn't match the softness of her question. She stepped back, hands folded in front of her. Her lower lip twitched. She didn't cry. She didn't speak again. Camilla didn't stop. "You may be a princess, but you are not the authority on everything you see. Learn your place, young lady." Her voice was louder now. A staff member near the archway turned sharply. Another guest lowered their glass mid-sip. Charlotte stood frozen, not in fear, but in disbelief. And that was the moment Catherine returned. She had re-entered through the adjoining corridor just in time to hear the tail end of Camilla's remark. She saw Charlotte's stiff posture, the way she wouldn't meet Camilla's eyes, and the flush rising in her daughter's cheeks. It took Catherine half a second to understand what had happened. The room was dead quiet. Even the ticking of the mantel clock felt too loud. Camilla hadn't seen Catherine walk in, but everyone else had. And in the silence that followed, the weight of what had just been said sank into the walls. Charlotte, still silent, looked up at her mother, and Catherine looked not at her daughter first, but directly at Camilla. The Duchess's expression didn't change, but everyone in the room could feel it. Something was coming, and Catherine's response would not just defend a child. It would define a moment that no one in that room would ever forget. Camilla's sudden outburst. The silence in the room was thick as Camilla realized too late that her words had been heard not just by the startled aides or the handful of lingering guests, but by Catherine herself, who now stood at the threshold with a stillness that demanded the room's full attention. Camilla instinctively straightened, brushing an invisible thread from her sleeve as if trying to compose herself, but her posture betrayed her. She had lost control, if only for a moment, and in the royal family, even a single misstep can echo for generations. Camilla had never meant to lose her temper, but behind her, smile and pearls had been a growing storm of pressure. The younger royals were increasingly at the center of public adoration. The press clung to every photograph of Catherine, every appearance by the Wales children, every kind gesture Charlotte gave to a stranger. It wasn't jealousy in the way tabloids describe it. It was something older, a quiet fear that legacy might pass her by, and that no amount of charity dinners or loyalty to the crown could replace the unspoken bond the public still held with Diana. And here was Charlotte, Diana's granddaughter, curious, thoughtful, instinctively graceful. The question about the chair wasn't a challenge, but Camilla heard it as one. She had read too much into the gesture, the phrasing, the way the child had pointed. Her voice, usually restrained in such company, had snapped before she even realized. And now the aftermath stood before her in the form of Catherine, calm, silent, watching. Charlotte didn't move. She hadn't cried or run behind her mother. She stood still, hands now folded behind her back, her eyes cast downward not in shame, but in quiet confusion. She had only asked a question. Camilla, sensing the weight of what she had just done, forced a thin smile. "It was nothing," she said quickly, waving her hand. "Just a misunderstanding." Charlotte was being inquisitive. She let out a small laugh that sounded brittle. "No harm done." Catherine still hadn't spoken. She stepped forward once, slowly, her eyes never leaving Camilla's. Behind her, one of the footmen subtly closed the gallery door to give the women privacy, but not before several others in the hallway had heard the exchange. Camilla continued, trying to reclaim control. "I'm sure you know how children can be. Curious. Boundaries must be taught early, don't you think?" Catherine blinked once, then spoke softly. "Boundaries, yes," she said, "but not by belittling a child's voice." Her tone was quiet, but it hit the room like thunder. Camilla stiffened, her mouth slightly open. Everyone else fell still. It was no longer about a question. It was about dignity. And in that moment, it was clear that Catherine had not come to escalate a scene. She had come to draw a line, one that would be remembered long after the portraits faded and the doors of Sandringham closed. The moment Catherine walked in. There are moments in royal history that change nothing on the surface but everything underneath. When Catherine stepped into the room at Sandringham, it wasn't with raised voice or accusation. She entered with the grace of a future, but the presence of a mother. Her heels clicked softly on the polished floor, but the sound was enough to shift every gaze in the room. Charlotte saw her first and blinked, relief flickering across her face for the briefest second. Camilla turned, already knowing what was about to come, though she had no idea how quietly devastating it would be. Catherine said nothing at first. She walked to Charlotte and crouched to her level, brushing her hand gently down the back of her daughter's arm. "Are you all right, darling?" she asked. Charlotte gave the smallest nod, eyes wide and shoulders stiff. Catherine stood again, slowly, and only then did she meet Camilla's gaze. The room was silent, save for the creak of the gallery door as it closed behind them. The tension did not come from volume, but from restraint. Camilla offered a smile that was more habit than warmth. "It was nothing," she said again. "We were just having a little moment of miscommunication." Catherine did not return the smile. She looked not at the room, not at the aides pretending to be invisible, but directly at the Queen Consort. "A miscommunication," she repeated softly, "is when words are misunderstood. What I heard was something else." Camilla shifted, her expression still fixed in formality. Charlotte asked a question about the throne chair. "I simply reminded her that some things in this house are not for touching." Catherine took a slow breath. Charlotte asked about her great-grandmother. She didn't climb the chair. She didn't disrespect it. She asked if Queen Elizabeth had ever used it. That's curiosity, not misbehavior. A pin could have dropped and been heard. No one moved. Even the portraits on the wall seemed to listen. Camilla's lips tightened. "Children need boundaries, Catherine." Catherine nodded. "Yes, and adults need to model them with care, especially in this house." There was no venom in her voice, only precision. It was not a defense born from anger, but from principle. A line had been crossed, not just in tone, but in presence. The words directed at Charlotte had not been disciplinary. They had been dismissive. They had reminded Catherine of another woman who had once walked these halls, asking questions and being silenced for it. She would not allow that cycle to begin again. She reached for Charlotte's hand. "Come, sweetheart." As they turned to leave the room, Camilla remained frozen in place. She had no response. Catherine had not shouted. She hadn't even raised her voice. But what she said had landed like a stone in still water, causing ripples that would stretch far beyond the four walls of that gallery. In a family that had so often chosen silence over truth, Catherine had chosen to speak. Not loudly, but with power. And in that moment, the entire royal order shifted. A silence that gripped the room. After Catherine's final words, the air inside the gallery became heavier than silence. No one dared move. The few aides stationed near the door, the senior staff pretending to study the paintings, even Camilla herself, all frozen in place. Catherine had not raised her voice, but the authority behind her tone had pierced through centuries of unspoken rules. This wasn't just a mother protecting her child, it was the future Queen of England reminding the present one that kindness was not optional. Charlotte walked beside her mother with quiet dignity, her small hand wrapped in Catherine's. She didn't glance back. She didn't need to. Whatever had just passed between the two most prominent women in the monarchy had ended, but its echo was just beginning. Camilla remained standing, alone in front of the portrait of Queen Elizabeth II. Her hands were still clasped, her posture still tall, but the color had drained from her face. She was used to commanding a room and setting the tone, but Catherine's words had done something rare. They had stopped her completely. One of the royal stewards quietly cleared his throat, breaking the unbearable silence. He moved toward the tray of tea, lifting it with delicate care as if trying not to disturb whatever atmosphere remained. Another aide stepped forward and whispered something to a nearby attendant, who then quickly exited the room. No one acknowledged the moment, and yet everyone felt it. In royal households, it's often not what is said that holds power, but what is left unspoken. And in this case, Catherine's choice to speak had created a vacuum where everyone else suddenly had nothing left to say. Camilla finally turned toward the doorway, perhaps hoping someone would intercept her, soften what had just occurred, and offer a redirection. But no one did. Even her closest staff understood this was not a scene to cover up. This was a line that had been drawn too clearly to erase. Catherine and Charlotte didn't return to the gathering that afternoon. A quiet message was passed that the Princess of Wales had taken her daughter for a walk in the gardens. It was said with warmth and no apology. For Catherine, the matter was closed. She had defended her daughter not with vengeance, but with truth. She had reminded the monarchy that power meant nothing without gentleness, that authority without compassion was simply noise. As the rest of the family resumed their polite conversation, carefully avoiding the topic, the room remained haunted by what had just occurred. not because it had been dramatic, but because it had been real. In a palace built on history and protocol, a single moment of honesty had cracked through the marble, and everyone knew it. The silence that followed Catherine's departure was not empty. It was loaded with reflection, with guilt, and with the quiet realization that something had shifted, and no one in that room could shift it back. Catherine's words that made the walls shake. As Catherine and Charlotte walked down the corridor, their footsteps softened by the thick royal carpets, the gallery door slowly closed behind them. But her words lingered like thunder. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't embarrassed. But what she said, and more importantly, how she said it, left an imprint deeper than any public scandal ever could. In just a few sentences, Catherine had spoken the unspeakable within palace walls. That being royal does not excuse you from humility, and that children, even those born into crowns, deserve respect. Inside the gallery, no one dared echo her words, but everyone replayed them. She asked about her great-grandmother. That's curiosity, not misbehavior. That line alone sliced through generations of silence that had weighed down the women in that family for decades. Catherine hadn't simply corrected Camilla. She had corrected a culture, one that had too often valued control over compassion. Camilla's team quickly tried to recover the tone of the room. One aide asked if tea should be served. Another suggested a walk to the stables. But no one responded with any real energy. The spell had been broken. The polite performance had ended. And the contrast between Catherine's calm conviction and Camilla's flustered defense had made the message unmistakable. Word of the encounter traveled fast through the inner palace. It wasn't shouted. It was whispered, shared between security officers, kitchen staff, and private secretaries. They didn't trade opinions. They just repeated Catherine's final sentence. Boundaries, yes, but not by belittling a child's voice. The line echoed through the halls, not like gossip, but like a quiet reckoning. In the past, confrontation like this would have been buried, managed, smoothed over with handshakes and carefully edited photographs. But Catherine hadn't left room for reinterpretation. Her words had not been emotional. They had been exact. They weren't for the press. They were for the room. And yet, they would ripple far beyond it. Later that evening, Catherine returned to the residence with Charlotte and Louis. William had already been briefed. When she recounted the event to him, she didn't dramatize it. She spoke as she always did, with clarity, with conviction, and with unwavering love for her children. William didn't ask questions. He simply said, "You did the right thing." No public statement would ever acknowledge what happened in that room. No official summary would include Charlotte's question or Camilla's outburst. But those who were there would never forget. They had seen a future queen speak not as a royal, but as a mother. And in doing so, she reminded everyone that strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it is a soft voice saying, "This ends here." Catherine's words didn't need to break protocol. They broke something far more important, an old, cold tradition of silence. And from the moment they were spoken, the palace would never be able to look at Charlotte the same way again, because her mother had made history, and everyone had heard it. William's stand beside his wife. The sun had nearly set over Sandringham when William finally arrived back at the residence. His helicopter had been delayed, but his mind was already tethered to home, to Catherine and to their children. He didn't expect a crisis, but as soon as he saw Catherine's face, composed but unreadable, he knew something had happened. They sat down in the drawing room, away from the staff, the children upstairs in their pajamas. And without drama or embellishment, Catherine told him everything. She described the gallery, Charlotte's question, Camilla's reaction, the coldness in her voice, the moment she walked in and heard it all. But more than that, she told him how Charlotte looked. Not upset, not wounded, but still, too still. The kind of stillness that only happens when something innocent is interrupted by something harsh. William didn't interrupt, he listened. And then he said exactly what Catherine needed to hear. "You did right by her." He wasn't just speaking as a father. He was speaking as a son who remembered his own mother being silenced in similar halls. He knew what it meant to stand beside someone who had been dismissed. He knew how it felt to watch someone you love shrink under scrutiny disguised as order. And more than anything, he knew he would never let that happen to his children. The next morning, William took quiet action. There were no threats, no confrontation, just a private conversation behind closed doors with Camilla. No aides present, no note-takers, just the future king and the queen consort. Those who passed by the study said the door remained closed for nearly 20 minutes, and when it opened, Camilla left first. Her face was calm, but pale. William followed a few minutes later, saying nothing to anyone. What was said in that meeting remains private, but the tone of the household changed afterward. Aides who had previously shifted awkwardly when Charlotte entered now smiled more quickly. Camilla kept a distance, respectful and quiet, and Charlotte, bright and perceptive, returned to her usual self, curious and composed. William's silence was not weakness, it was strategy. He knew the weight of words when spoken from his position, but he also knew when words were unnecessary. Catherine had drawn the line. His role was to hold it firm. Together they moved as one, not for appearance but for protection. And in that unity, the palace saw something it hadn't expected. A couple not ruled by image but by integrity. A prince who stood not just beside his wife but behind his daughter. And a mother whose voice would not be softened, even in the company of a queen. It wasn't a scandal, it wasn't a war. It was something more enduring. A reminder that real power isn't in the crown you wear. It's in how you guard those who can't speak as loudly for themselves. And in that, William and Catherine stood unshaken. The palace response behind closed doors. Within hours of the quiet confrontation at Sandringham, the palace machinery began humming behind the scenes. There was no press release, no public leak, no headline-grabbing fallout. However, within the upper echelons of royal administration, the incident involving Camilla, Charlotte, and Catherine had sparked a chain reaction, not due to scandal, but because of its symbolic significance. A generational boundary had been drawn, and the institution had to decide whether to ignore it or respect it. Senior aides met in small groups, some revisiting existing protocols regarding interactions with the children, especially during formal or semi-private engagements. One long-serving advisor suggested the royal household needed a reminder of the soft lines, meaning emotional boundaries, personal space, and tone when addressing the young royals. Another quietly observed that Catherine had shifted the tone of expectation, and it would be unwise to pretend nothing had happened. The Queen's private secretary received a briefing, not a formal document, but a verbal summary of the incident and its handling. It was conveyed with care, focusing not on the disagreement, but on Catherine's conduct, William's quiet follow-up, and Charlotte's behavior afterward. The message was clear. The Princess of Wales had handled the situation with dignity, restraint, and clarity. She had not embarrassed anyone, but she had drawn a line, and it had been noticed. Camilla, for her part, maintained public composure. She appeared the following day at a scheduled event in Norfolk, smiling tightly and sticking closely to the script. But those nearest to her noted a distinct coolness in her energy, a quiet recognition that she had crossed an invisible line not just with a child, but with the future queen. Even those who had long supported her position in the family knew better than to suggest she was in the right. Catherine and William made no further mention of the moment, not to staff, not to friends, not even in passing. Their silence was deliberate, not to bury the truth, but to protect Charlotte from the noise. And yet, everyone who needed to know understood the message. The Wales household would not tolerate emotional carelessness, especially not toward their children. Among the younger staff, admiration grew. Some had entered royal service in the post-Diana era, believing change was possible but far off. But now they saw it happening quietly, from within. Catherine's approach, grace under fire, calm in correction, and unwavering in her motherhood, had set a new tone for how influence could be wielded. One junior aide remarked to a colleague that evening, "The way she handled it wasn't about control, it was about care." And in those simple words, the palace saw its future reflected, not in spectacle, but in strength of character. The incident would never be mentioned in official archives, but for those who bore witness, it marked a quiet turning point in how the next era of monarchy would be led, with humility, with clarity, and with an unshakable sense of what truly matters behind the crown. Why Catherine's reaction changed everything. For years, the royal family had existed on a careful balance of silence and symbolism. Discomfort was smoothed over with polite smiles, friction was buried under flawless photographs, and the children, especially the heirs, were expected to behave with royal grace, even when they were far too young to understand what that meant. But in that single moment at Sandringham, when Catherine stepped between Camilla and Charlotte with calm, resolute words, everything shifted, not in spectacle, but in spirit. Catherine didn't make a scene. She didn't call for attention or demand apologies. What she did was far more powerful. She named what had been wrong and honored the voice of a child who in any other royal generation would have been expected to stay quiet. It was the kind of moment Diana had rarely been allowed to have, the kind of protection Diana herself had often gone without, and that's what made it unforgettable. Behind the palace walls, people started rethinking what it meant to be royal. It wasn't just about protocol anymore. It was about presence. Catherine had shown that a future queen could lead with emotional intelligence, with boundaries wrapped in grace. That motherhood wasn't a side role to her title. It was the very thing that gave her authority its weight. Charlotte, young as she was, learned something that day. Not just that her mother would stand up for her, but that her voice mattered, even in a palace where voices are often hushed. And the royal staff who witnessed it, they walked away not with gossip but with awe. Not because Catherine had embarrassed Camilla, but because she hadn't. She could have unleashed anger. She chose integrity instead. The entire family, even the distant cousins and titled in-laws, felt the ripple. Conversations became more careful. Invitations to engagements with the children were reviewed more thoughtfully. Camilla, though not publicly rebuked, became more restrained in her interactions, not out of fear, but from the subtle understanding that Catherine's silence after the incident was not a retreat. It was strength. For the monarchy, which has always depended on image, this moment became an invisible watermark on the crown's future. It would never be in the official records, but within the palace it became the reference point for how the next generation would lead. And for Catherine, it wasn't a victory. It was a promise kept to her daughter, to her family, and to the kind of kingdom she hoped to shape. One where kindness was not weakness, where a child's question could be met with wonder, and where queens didn't rule by fear, but by love. The history books may never write about the day Catherine stood in that gallery, but those who were there, they will never forget it, because in one quiet moment, the future queen redefined what power truly looks like, and she did it without raising her voice. In a palace built on centuries of tradition and unspoken rules, Catherine's quiet defense of her daughter became a moment that changed everything. Not through scandal, but through dignity. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't seek attention, but with a single act of maternal courage, she reminded the monarchy that real power is rooted in protection, not position. Her words weren't just for Charlotte. They echoed for every child who's ever been told to shrink in silence. Camilla may have held the title of queen consort, but that day it was Catherine who ruled, with grace, with clarity, and with unshakable love. She didn't just defend Charlotte, she set a new standard for what royal strength looks like. And in doing so, she quietly redefined the monarchy's future. This wasn't a story about conflict. It was a story about conviction, about a mother who stood up, not just for her daughter, but for a different kind of legacy. Thank you for watching. If you believe that quiet courage speaks louder than tradition, that love is the truest form of leadership, and that Catherine showed us what true royalty looks like, then like, comment, and subscribe. Because history is not always made with a crown. Sometimes it's made with a whisper.